On behalf of the House Democratic Caucus, I want to thank all the members of the press corps for being here this morning. Week 8 of the legislative session has come to an end, and certain things are crystal clear. Oklahoma, in particular, Oklahoma's budgetary situation is in abject crisis. When you look out across the state of Oklahoma, it would be rare to find an interest group: children, senior citizens, doctors, nurses, veterans, road workers. It'd be very difficult to find any of those particular interest groups who are not suffering in this current economic environment. You look at what the school district of Oklahoma City announced yesterday, that they're laying off nearly 208 public school teachers. I know some people are frustrated and upset with the Oklahoma City Public School District for making that decision. The House Democrats want to make it perfectly clear to everybody, whether you live in Oklahoma City or anywhere else in the state, it's not the school district in Oklahoma City's fault that they're having to lay off 208 people. It's because of an abject leadership failure at the state capitol that the school district in Oklahoma City is laying off 208 people. DHS is looking at cutting back services for over 700 families when it comes to child abuse prevention. It's not DHS's fault that some of those families are looking at a loss of services that may protect the lives and the futures of children in Oklahoma from child abuse. It is the abject leadership failure that's occurred at the state capitol that has put us here. And the fact that we are now I'm standing here before you Thursday in an empty legislative chamber. The House of Representatives isn't in session today. It wasn't in session last Thursday. We normally are, but the legislature in their infinite wisdom has decided to go home and do something else this particular day, at a time in which the budget crisis only gets worse, only gets deeper with each and every day as it passes. We're looking at another potential revenue failure here in just another couple of weeks when the end of March and the beginning of April begin. And yet, instead of staying here and doing the people's business, everybody's gone back home. It's mind-boggling to those of us in the House Democratic Caucus. We're now 8 weeks in, and not one piece of legislation to solve the budgetary crisis facing the people of Oklahoma has been put before the House of Representatives. They may argue, the House Majority Caucus may argue that, well, we had a situation in which we voted on an internet tax, trying to raise taxes on those who purchase items from Amazon and other places. But as we've said before, and as federal law has stated, there's not $1 that's going to come out of that until the federal government acts. And so therefore, we literally have finished 8 weeks of the legislative session and done nothing to close the $1.3 billion budget hole. And in fact, all we've done since the beginning of session is, instead of finding a way to close the hole, we've made the hole bigger. Because even though this week the governor signed the emergency order to get rainy day money to our public schools and to the Department of Corrections, and many in the Republican caucus in the House and Senate and the governor's office are sort of doing a celebration dance that look at how wonderful we are because we got $51 million to public education, and somehow that makes them saviors of public schools. Make no mistake about it, since January 1, our public school system has lost $109 million. So even though $51 million may have come in this week, our public schools are still down $58 million in the first 2.5 months of 2016, when the Middale Public Schools was set to lose $3.5 million because of this revenue failure. And that meant gifted and talented programs were gone, elementary music programs were gone, elementary athletic programs were gone. Middale wasn't playing politics with the parents or with the Republican leadership. They were simply saying, hey, the decisions you've made have put us in this situation, and the only way it's going to change is if the parents see what's happening in their public schools. And so what the superintendent and I think the school board were doing in Oklahoma City was to say, odds are this is where we're going to be. You parents need to know it, need to prepare for it. And oh, by the way, the legislature needs to know this is what your decisions could do. And Oklahoma City is just one school district out of 500 in the state. They're essentially the canary in the coal mine. With Oklahoma City losing 208 teachers out of a district that has thousands, that's going to hurt badly. But imagine those small schools throughout the state of Oklahoma who may have to lose 2 or 3 when they've only got 15 in the building. There's a real dire situation before our public school system in Oklahoma right now, and I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. We are in an abject fiscal crisis and an abject leadership crisis, and it's going to take some difficult decisions and some real leaders to try to turn this thing around. And when you talk about leadership, you look at all the issues that have been facing our public schools and our other state agencies, in particular with public schools this year, instead of finding ways to raise revenue, they've offered up opportunities to cut back revenue with vouchers, or they've offered up deregulation bills that would hurt teachers and students. And then this week, we saw more political games being played with our students and the standards that are necessary to educate them. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen the Republican majority tell our teachers and students and administrators that they were going to study and learn under one set of standards. And then a year or so would go by and they said, no, we didn't mean it. Now we're going to give you another set of standards. And then a year or so would go by and they said, well, now we're going to come up with a different set ourselves. And finally, we thought we had a good set of standards. The superintendent and legislative leader said, please let those go into effect. But then this week, we saw House and Senate Republicans decide to play games with those. And instead of allowing them to take effect today, they passed resolutions that would force the State Department of Education to jump through more hoops before those standards could take effect. And then, because of a lack of leadership, apparently a lack of communication from both chambers, both resolutions that were passed out of the House and Senate somehow just dissipated without being voted on in the other chamber. It is incomprehensible to me to think that the governor, the Senate pro tem, and the speaker hadn't discussed what their overall plans were as it pertained to the standards for our public school students. But apparently, that's where we are. It is evident to all of us in this building, and I think it's evident to all of Oklahomans who are paying attention to what's happening to vulnerable folks in this state, that this building lacks leadership, and that if we're going to solve the problems facing Oklahoma, we're going to have, in the next 8 weeks, it's going to take a real change in the behavior from those folks who currently run this show. We think the biggest disappointment that will come out of this session won't necessarily be the dramatic budget cuts, and those are going to be exceptionally disappointing. The people are going to suffer. They're already suffering in Oklahoma. Veterans and seniors and children are already suffering. They're going to suffer even more under this budget when it comes out here in a few months. But we think even the bigger disappointment than that is the fact that the legislative leaders who run this building will not have learned the lessons of what got us here. They're just going to wring their hands and blame the price of oil, not looking back on $1 billion worth of tax cuts, $2 billion worth of tax credits and exemptions, the lowest gross production taxes in the region, which really got us to this situation. They're going to leave all those alone and not make those changes, those systematic changes. And they're simply going to sweep one-time revolving funds. They're going to try to do one-time bonding money and things that, like that measure, that are just simply Band-Aids on a gaping hole. And if that happens, then what we're looking at is future budgets. Next year, the year after next, maybe 3 years out, of doing similar things, more one-time fixes to patch really, really ugly holes, because the leadership won't solve the systematic problem facing this state, which was fiscally irresponsible tax cuts, tax credits, and gross production tax decisions. Our caucus has said all along that the reason we're in this mess isn't because we don't tax senior citizens going to doctor's visits, or because we don't tax people who get a haircut, which is what has been offered up by the governor. Well, we need to do a sales tax on things like that. That's not why we're here. We're here because we cut $1 billion worth of income taxes, $2 billion worth of tax credits and exemptions, and the lowest gross production tax in the region. And so, from our perspective, if the governor chooses and the Republican leaders choose to take the tax burden from those folks who can best afford it and shift that over to middle class and lower middle class families by making them pay more when they see the doctor or when they get a haircut, we're absolutely opposed to that, because those are structural changes to the way we get revenue in the state, but they're structural changes that go from some of the wealthiest and most powerful special interest groups in the state, and instead of the burden being placed there, they're placed on working families, and we refuse to do that. On the cigarette tax, we've said all along, the fact that somebody doesn't pay $1.50 extra for cigarettes is not why we're in this budget hole. And so if you want to raise taxes on cigarette smokers to backfill your $1 billion worth of tax cuts, that's not where we're going to be. And not only do we think that's a shift in the tax structure from wealthy corporations and wealthy folks down to middle class and lower middle class folks, but we also know that the cigarette tax is a diminishing return. Unlike if you were to roll the income tax cut back and you're guaranteed to get $157 million more this year and actually more the following years, if you increase cigarette taxes, the first year it may bring you in $150, $160 million, but as it gets more expensive to smoke cigarettes, fewer people smoke them, which means fewer dollars come back into the GR a couple of years from now. So it will not solve the problem. We are open to looking at the tax credits and exemptions as long as they're done in a fair, manner. If they're going to go in and just pick winners and losers based upon who's got the most powerful lobbyist, that's not where we are. We want to actually look at the tax credits and see those that are creating jobs and those that aren't. Those are taking more money out of the general revenue than they're putting back in. And those, if they can demonstrate that, then we're willing to take a good look at those. When it comes to the other measures, our caucus, while we are frustrated by the idea of shifting the tax burden to those folks who smoke cigarettes or other things like that, we're not fundamentally opposed to looking at those issues. Our point is this: we're willing to have that discussion if they're willing to talk about what really got us here, right? It makes no sense at all to say we have to raise cigarette taxes right now to bring in $160 million, which is what it essentially would bring in, when in January the Republican majority let an income tax cut take effect that will cost the budget $160 million. If they really cared about raising $160 million, they would have stopped the income tax cut and not raised taxes on people who smoke. If they wanted to bring in real revenue, they could have said, let's stop the income tax in January and look at a tax increase on cigarette smokers if that's what they wanted to do. And now you're looking at $320 million to fill the hole. That's not what they did, because they'd rather play politics with tax cuts. They'd rather go back to their constituents and say, we cut your taxes with one hand, and hope that they don't realize that they're trying to raise their taxes on haircuts, cigarettes, and internet services on the other. The issue behind bonding is this: we look at what they're doing as sort of like some of those folks who like to live hard and party hard all month long. They get their paycheck at the end of the month and they spend it for the first 3 weeks of the month. Then they get down to the last week and they look up and they say, oh my goodness, we've got a whole lot of bills to pay. We've just spent all of our money on tax cuts and tax credits and exemptions. So what do? They take out their credit card and put their debt, all their bills on a credit card, and say, we'll call it good. If they come out with trying to take out more debt from a bond, what they're going to do is they're going to have a one-time fix, not fix the structural problems. And not only will they not fix the structural problems, they're going to make it worse, because under the current structure, the discussion is maybe taking out a $300 million bond proposal for ODOT money and maybe $100 million worth of a bond proposal from the County Improvement for Roads and Bridges money. If you put that together, it's $400 million worth of a bond. It's about $32 million a year worth of debt service on those bonds. So over a 15-year note, that $400 million worth of a bond is going to cost the taxpayers $80 million in interest just to pay it off. So the one-time fix is creating another $80 million hole. And so that is just not the way you get out of this mess. If you're going to get out of a hole, you got to quit digging. And bonding and more debt service, in our opinion, is just taking the shovel and digging it deeper. There are folks with whom we work in the majority caucus who believe that that the government service should be even smaller than they are today. But my challenge to them and to those at places like the Oklahoma Council for Public Affairs, if I had gone to those conservative Republicans 10 years ago and said, here's the plan. In the next decade, or the next 5 or 6 years, we're going to cut the average state agency by 30%. We're going to cut the state budget by $1.5 billion. What do you think about that? They would have done cartwheels, said, you bet this is wonderful. Well, that's exactly what's happened. The budget's been cut. A couple of years ago, we had a $200 million shortfall. Last year was $600 million. Now it's $1.3 billion. Most agencies have been cut nearly between 25 to 30%, some more than that. And yet you still have folks going, no, we need to cut further. Well, what's happening? You've got DHS that has kids in crisis that are going to lose access to the care that they need to protect their lives. You've got kids in our public school system that are losing teachers. You've got ODOT looking at whether or not their funding is going to be there to continue some of the important 8-year projects that they've got on their books. This is just a horrible situation that has really been brought upon by the folks who run the show. We all knew the price of oil would one day fall. We all did, and that's the reason my caucus stood up against the fiscally irresponsible decisions of the last 5 or 6 years, saying one day it's going to turn around, and it has, and now we're all paying for it.